Generation and renewal, and that's what the Labour Party is promising the UK at its conference here. The leader, Sir Keir Starmer, will speak later today against, of course, a backdrop of economic turmoil. Well, the Scottish Labour leader, Anas Sarwar, joins me now. Good morning, Mr Sarwar. Welcome to this horse box we've commandeered.
I mean, the BBC are really pushing the boat out for you.
Well, as you can see, I've actually, because we've been talking about this so much this morning, it is a horse box, but it's kitted out very nicely. I've posted a couple of pictures on Twitter. Anyway, listen, to business. This conference is billed as a big moment for Labour. I was driving down yesterday, listening to people talking about this atmosphere of great optimism, a real sense that this is a party on the verge of something big. Really? Is it? I mean, why?
I think you'll notice, actually, it's a very different atmosphere at conference this year to previous years, and it is more serious.
Yeah, nobody's booing the leader.
Yeah, I was talking to some journalists yesterday who were saying it was boring. I said I prefer the serious rather than boring, and I think the reason for that is, I think this is a political party that is serious again. I think that's a party that is desperate to win again. And I honestly believe it's a political party that's ready to lead again. And our challenge in the face of all the crises we've seen, not just in the last 12 years, I could say, last 12 years, but last week in particular, I think in the face of that, Labour is now setting out not just why the Tories deserve to lose, but actually why Labour deserves to win and what we can do to change this country.
But where's the big offer? Well, hasn't been made yet, has it?
Well, look, you heard from Rachel Reeves yesterday a clear identity about how we grow our economy, how she becomes a Green Chancellor, how that's backed up by a proper climate renewal right here, but also
more
globally. Look, and economic competence. Let's be clear about that. The big attack we've had from the Conservatives year after year after year is Labour is economically illiterate, it can't do this, it goes backwards. We're going to be taken over from the most economically illiterate, morally bankrupt government probably in history. I said this yesterday in my speech. We cheered Boris Johnson going, and we rightly did, because he dishonoured the role of Prime Minister, but actually Liz Truss is worse than Boris Johnson. She is more right-wing, more ideological, cutting the cap on bankers' bonuses, giving the tax cuts to the richest. She is redistributing wealth, but from the poorest to the wealthiest. I actually think she's more dangerous than Margaret Thatcher, and I think the country is going to change that.
I was talking to Paul Mason earlier on about this. I mean, he was an advisor to John McDonnell in the last election. John McDonnell wanted to borrow hundreds of billions of pounds for the Green New Deal. I mean, borrowing money and making sure poor people are a bit better off is something that would have got a standing ovation at Labour conferences in the past, isn't it?
Well, look, it's bigger than that. Of course we have to lift poverty. Of course we absolutely have to do that. That has to be a priority for this government. We want to eradicate child poverty, not just cut child poverty. But actually we've got to do bigger than that as well. How do we rebuild this economy? How do we make sure it works for everyone? How do we support businesses, both small and large? How do we renew our National Health Service? How do we have the skills and the ingenuity in this country? But also how, frankly, do we stop the United Kingdom looking like it wants to turn its back on the world, but instead embrace the world and be a world leader in all these things? That's what we want to see, and I want Scotland to be absolutely at the heart of that.
I was at your speech yesterday. You were making some bold predictions, actually. You were saying that Scotland is going to deliver the seats that push Keir Starmer across the doorstep of Downing Street. Are you?
I absolutely believe that, because
which seats?
The last three general elections, I think the choice in Scotland has not been how do we get rid of this Tory government. I don't think people in the last three elections have thought Labour could win the last three general elections. I think this next general election is going to be different. We need to break the psychological barrier about whether Labour can win or not, and I'm confident Labour can win, Labour will win, and I'm confident in that context.
Where are you getting the votes from?
From people across the country. Go out there, Martin, speak to people who are so angry, so frustrated. We don't have to go back to the old arguments and old divisions about everything being binary choices. Instead, people can see that there is a majority for change in Scotland.
You're taking the votes back from the SNP. See, here's the thing. There's a problem with optics.
Let me explain that to you, Martin. I genuinely believe, and I say this directly to people, I don't support independence. I don't support a referendum. But one thing we can all agree on across the country is there is a majority, I believe, in Scotland and across the UK to get rid of the Tories. So I say directly to people, you might disagree with me on the final destination for Scotland, but that doesn't mean we can't work together to get rid of this government and change our country in the process.
People will have heard you making those arguments last night and seen you on the evening news programmes delivering those statements from in front of a massive Union Jack at a conference which began with a big rousing rendition of God Save the King. Does that do much to win you votes back, votes that have turned nationalist?
Well, I think there's, in that context, you have to think about, and I say this about UK elections, I also say it about Scottish elections, and indeed Mark Drakeford would tell you about Welsh elections. You do not win an election if you don't look like you're on the side of the people you want to govern. Labour cannot win a UK general election if it's not on the side of Britain, and Scottish Labour can't win a Scottish election if it's not on the side of Scotland, and Welsh Labour can't win a Welsh election if it's not on the side of Wales. And I think we can be proudly patriotic, we can champion the fact, be proud of the fact we are Scottish, but also say we want to be part of something bigger and change the United Kingdom in the process. I don't think this is as good as it gets. I accept the United Kingdom look like it's gone backwards under this government. Is this the best we can do, this Tory government led by Liz Truss? I think the United Kingdom is better, can be better, and we can deliver better, and I want Labour to do that.
Every poll in Scotland suggests that the dial's not really shifting at all, is it? At the moment?
That's not true.
So where's this confidence? Somebody told me yesterday you're looking at 50. You want 15 seats in the next election. Is that a number you recognise?
Look, I'm not going to put a number on it.
You got one at the moment.
Look, I'm not going to put a number on it, but
you must be in the back rooms.
I'm not going to put a number on it. I want us to make significant gains. If you look at the council election results, we were in the game in around 13, 14 seats. If that council election result was reflected, I'm not saying we would have won 13, 14 seats, but we're in the game in 13, 14 seats. I think in the context of a UK government where we're not just opposing the Tories, we're going to replace them. I genuinely believe we can make significant gains, and I think Scotland's not going to be the drag on the ticket. Scotland's not going to be what stops us having a UK Labour government. Scotland's going to help us deliver that UK Labour government.
Let me ask you a couple more questions. The Supreme Court, we're going to be talking about a lot in the weeks ahead. They're going to issue at some point in the near future their verdict on whether or not it would be legal for the Scottish Government to hold a referendum. If they come out and say yes, actually it is legal, they do have the right, do you accept that judgment and just get on with the campaign?
Well, look, I said at the time that I think it's right that we establish the legal basis of any referendum. I think that is the correct thing to do, and the safe thing to do, and the right thing to do, and the democratically right thing to do. But also, timing matters. And my argument would be that at this time of crisis, when we're in the midst of a cost of living crisis, when we see the pound plunging because of this economically illiterate, morally bankrupt Tory government.
So if the highest court in the country comes out and says yes, you can do it, you don't accept that. You say, well, maybe at some point, but not now, which is what you're saying already.
I've said we would accept the court judgment. It's for lawyers to decide the legal basis. I don't support independence. I don't support a referendum right now. But it's right we establish a legal basis.
But it wouldn't be up to you. It would be up to the SNP.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't consider timing. Timing is also important in this.
So you would say to the SNP, please don't do it yet, but we accept that you have the right to do it.
Let's not prejudge the court decision.
OK. There's a documentary coming out tonight on the ferries story. You will not have seen that yet. It broadcast this evening, but we've been trailing
I saw a bit
it
of copy of it this morning.
Yeah, OK, so you know what we're talking about. There's all sorts of suggestions about the way the contract was handled and so on. Listen, I'm not going to ask you to comment on the documentary, but you know roughly the story. Any line on that?
Look, I think the most serious thing is this, that clearly something is really going off here. And I think there is a question about corruption here. I think there is a question about a rigged system here, and I think the people that have paid the price ultimately here are those workers whose reputation has been tarnished, who deserve to get even more ferry contracts, not be stuck in the mire of this terrible management and government, but also the ferry users have been failed, island communities have been failed, and we need answers on that and accountability. All
right, more on that, I'm sure, after the documentary has been broadcast. There'll be plenty more discussion. In the meantime, Anas Sarwar, leader of Scottish Labour, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Martin.
Well, let's talk.
Get the latest news on your smart speaker whenever you want. Just say, play BBC News for Scotland.
24 minutes to 9 now. You're listening to Friday's Good Morning Scotland with Graham Stewart and Laura McKeever. As we've been hearing, the SNP is getting ready to hold its 88th annual conference. It's taking place in Aberdeen and will be the first in-person conference since before the pandemic in 2019. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, is there and joins us now. A very good morning to you, First Minister. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Laura. Pleasure to be with you.
So it's the eve of the conference, and as you wind up your gathering there next week, of course, the case that could allow you to legislate for another independence referendum will hear arguments. Let's talk about that first. Should that case go in your favour, as it were, does it leave enough time for you, in your view, to have a bill, a campaign, all the questions people want answered, and then to have an independence referendum by October 2023, as you wish?
Yes, I mean, we've worked out the time frame for that. Obviously, I can't determine exactly when the Supreme Court will issue its judgment after next week's hearing, but assuming we get a judgment round about the turn of the year, then there is time for the Scottish Parliament to legislate for a referendum in October next year. And of course, the process of updating the prospectus from 2014, setting out answers to the questions, is already underway. You know, next week, the in the days after our conference, we'll set out the next of the Building a New Scotland papers that will look at specifically economic issues. So yes, there is time, and if we consider the events of the last few weeks, there is absolutely a very clear, I think, case for Scotland becoming independent so that we can chart our own course and build the kind of Scotland we want, rather than be constantly subjected to the chaos of Westminster governance and being taken down the wrong path by Westminster governments.
If people want to replace that current Conservative government at the first opportunity, they're surely better voting Labour in the next general election.
Well, I mean, I think I'd make 3 quick points to that. Actually, factually, that's not true. Every Tory seat in Scotland has the SNP as the key challenger. So if you want to take away Tory seats and get rid of the Tories, it's a statement of fact that the way to do that is voting SNP.
People could tactically vote in those seats.
Well, secondly, the part of the case for independence is that the outcome of general elections rarely, if ever, depends on Scottish votes. Every single person in Scotland could have voted Labour at the last general election. We'd still have a Tory government, and that's the democratic case for independence. If we want to get the governments we vote for, we need to be independent. But my third and final point on that is that you take the biggest issue that has been imposed upon Scotland in recent years that is doing real damage to our economy, to our ability to attract people to come and work in Scotland is Brexit, imposed on us by the Tories. But now we've got Labour saying that they wouldn't reverse Brexit, they wouldn't take us back into the European Union, they wouldn't even take us back into the single market. If Scotland wants to get back into the heart of Europe, which is good for our economy, good for our society, then we need to be independent. Otherwise, we have Westminster governments, whether they are Tory governments or brief respites from that with Labour governments, making these decisions for us, and the decisions are very often not in our interest.
If the Supreme Court rules against you, you've said you'll fight the next general election on the single issue of independence. What empowers you to dictate the terms of a general election to elect members of the UK Parliament? And do you think Scottish voters and independent supporters truly want that? When there's a cost of living crisis, when there's all manner of different things that people vote on in general elections?
Well, let me unpack that a bit, because there's a few different issues in there. Firstly, I don't want to be in that scenario. If we are in that scenario of the issue being put to people in a general election, it's because Westminster has successfully blocked our ability to have a referendum, notwithstanding the fact that I was elected as First Minister.
But it will be after a legal process.
Well, the legal process is only deciding whether or not the Scottish Parliament can legislate. The legal process wouldn't stop Westminster doing the right thing, which, had it done, we wouldn't even have to be in front of the court, which is agreeing that although we differ on the issue of independence, there should be a process to allow the people of Scotland to decide. That's the democratic way of doing things. Now, the 2 other bits of your question there. One is this what people need in a cost of living crisis? So much of what we are dealing with right now, from the economic impact of Brexit to soaring inflation, the cost of living crisis, what we've seen in the past couple of weeks as the Tories have tanked the economy, so much of that is happening to Scotland because we're not independent. We're hearing stories today about potential energy shortages over this winter. Scotland is a net exporter of electricity. We already generate enough renewables to cover almost 100% of our electricity
Well, no, production
needs.
and consumption of energy are not the same thing. And it's also renewable energy at the moment is not consistent enough for us to be self-sufficient. Half of what we used last year, I believe, was green.
We're part of a GB grid, but the point is...
Would an independent Scotland stay part of that GB grid?
That would be a choice that an independent Scotland would have. Ideally, we would stay part of that grid, but the key thing would be to design an energy market that allowed us to benefit from our renewables potential, instead having a situation where we've got all of this current installed capacity and even greater potential in the future, but are still penalised by soaring gas prices and potential shortages. That's just one example of where Scotland is restricted right now by not having the powers of independence.
OK, let's talk about some financial...
I haven't answered all your questions. You asked me a final part of that question, which was what gives me the right to dictate the terms of an election. It's up to the people of Scotland to decide what the issues they vote on are, but every party has the right and exercises that right in election to say to people, this is what I'm asking you to vote for. Now, if we're in that scenario, which would only be because Westminster was blocking democracy, I'll put that question and ask people to decide in that election whether or not they think Scotland should be independent.
OK, let's talk about currency. It was a big issue for many voters in 2014. The financial turmoil of the past few weeks mean currency, borrowing, monetary policy very much in the spotlight. How quickly would an independent Scotland establish a Scottish central bank? And what might that bank's borrowing capabilities be, especially while Scotland was still using the pound?
OK, again, let me address these questions bit by bit. Firstly, I think I said to you earlier on that we will publish a paper in the days after our conference on the economic case for independence. Part of that paper will be looking at currency and the transition from where we are right now to where we would go in the future. In terms of, and so much of this detail will be set out there, but I'll give you some of that right now. So in terms of setting up a central bank, we would start that process as soon as Scotland had voted for independence, and that central bank would be the provider of advice to the Scottish Government on these matters. It would be the lender of last resort for our financial services industry. It would require reserves that could cover these limited functions in that first period. We have said, and this is my party's position, that we would move from using the pound. We would continue to use the pound after independence. It's Scotland's currency as much as it is the currency of the rest of the UK, an internationally traded currency, obviously because of the actions of the UK government. It's worth significantly less than it was just a few weeks ago. And we would move to a Scottish pound when the economic conditions were right, and that
How
would
long
be
do you think that
advised
might
by
be?
the central bank. Well, look, we'll set out the detail of this when we publish the paper, but it's important that it is guided by principles rather than fixed timescales. So the economic conditions, the building of the capacity in the central bank, and the
central bank wouldn't be able to adjust interest rates, though, would it, while using the pound?
Well, not while we're using the pound. The Bank of England would continue to be in charge of monetary policy, but as we move to a Scottish pound, the Scottish Central Bank would take up many of these functions. So this would be a transition. One of the lessons of the last couple of weeks...
Would it have similar borrowing powers, though, to the Bank of England?
It would have similar powers if we were using a Scottish currency. And again, we'll set out the functions, the detail of this in this paper. The point I was going to... Can I just finish this point? One of the lessons of the last couple of weeks, which is something we've always taken seriously, but this has been underlined, is the importance of responsibility in these matters, of good planning, of being very clear about what you're seeking to achieve. You know, people often
so people
think
will get
the financial
those
markets
from next week, will they, in that paper?
I think in the days after we complete our conference and after the Supreme Court case. But can I say, people think the financial markets are abstract, but we've seen very clearly the impact on real people when the financial markets lose confidence. So that underlines the importance of us, as we plan for independence, being careful, being responsible, and understanding the detail of what we're seeking to do.
Let's talk about the NHS. A&E waiting times are the worst since records began. 1 in 10 operations were cancelled in August. Ambulance waits are growing. We're commonly seeing queues of ambulances outside hospitals. You spoke in Parliament yesterday about these failures as being unacceptable. Is that strong enough a word for these failures? What do you say to people who have lost family members, people who have needlessly died as a result of these delays, as we've been told from the Royal College of Emergency Medicine?
Look, our word's strong enough. People have a right to look more at what we're doing rather than the words I choose to use. And what we're doing is continuing to support investment and recruitment in the NHS, changing where necessary the way healthcare is delivered and the pathways of care to ensure that the NHS, which is not just in Scotland but across the UK and the world, facing really significant challenges from the impact and the backlogs of COVID and some of the underlying trends in terms of the changing demographics.
The BMA say that you're relying on short-term fixes and that these problems predate COVID.
Actually, that last point is one that I just made there. There are issues that predate COVID. The demographics of our population have been changing. That's true, globally as it is in Scotland. But there is no doubt that COVID has had a significant impact on the NHS here and elsewhere. In terms of the issue of short-term, there are always short-term things you need to do to support the NHS to cope with peaks in demand and particularly difficult periods, and that is the case during winter. It will be particularly the case during this winter.
Can you avert this looming nurse strike?
Well, we are negotiating with unions about fair pay. NHS staff in Scotland, on the whole, Agenda for Change staff are the best paid anywhere in the UK. There is an offer being made. The Health Secretary said this week we're looking to improve that offer, and we will, as we did with council workers, we will work really hard to ensure that we get an agreement that has those who work so hard in our health service paid as fairly as we can possibly manage, and of course averts that potential in the health service. But what I was going to say is there are longer term reforms that we need in the health service. So we've been taking long-term action. That's why we've got record levels of staffing and investment. We are moving forward now with a national care service because social care is as important as the national health service. These things are all incredibly difficult for governments everywhere. The last point I would make here, which I don't make to underplay in any way the challenges in Scotland, but to put this into context, every country is dealing with this right now. Scotland's A&Es, although we have massive challenges, remain the best performing anywhere in the UK. And
would you feel safe phoning an ambulance this weekend for your
I would encourage
anybody
anybody who needs an ambulance to phone an ambulance. And that's another really important point to make. Any person whose experience in the NHS is not what it should be, that is unacceptable, or whatever word the opposition want me to use. But the vast majority of people who need the NHS get an outstanding level of care for the NHS thanks to the dedication of those who work in it, and people should have confidence in our National Health Service.
One last question, First Minister. The author J.K. Rowling wore a T-shirt yesterday saying Nicola Sturgeon, destroyer of women's rights. This was as hundreds protested outside Parliament against the gender recognition legislation. How do you respond to Ms Rowling? And have you got this legislation right?
Well, let me come on to the legislation in a second. People are entitled to express their views, and they're entitled to express their views in whatever way they think is fit. I mean, I've always thought that on this issue, where people have very strong views, we should all try to treat each other with respect, and that's what I will continue to do. In terms of the legislation, it is going through the scrutiny process in the Scottish Parliament. The committee that's been looking at it published its report yesterday and gave approval by majority to this legislation, and the Parliament as a whole will look at it in the week after the October recess. So that process of scrutiny is there. This bill is about reforming an existing process that is degrading and traumatic for trans people, seeking to make it less traumatic for those who want to legally change their gender. It doesn't give any additional rights to trans people, nor does it take any rights away from women. Trans people are one of the most...
Are the victims of sexual assault and domestic abuse wrong then when they express fears and concerns about this and about women's safe spaces?
Victims of sexual assault and abuse are never wrong to express concerns, but it's abusive men who are responsible for that, not trans women. And we need to focus on those who commit those appalling acts of sexual violence and domestic abuse against women. And my government has done a great deal legislatively in terms of support for those who work with victims of sexual violence and domestic abuse, and always will do. It's men who attack women, and we need to focus on that, not on further stigmatising and discriminating against a tiny group in our society that are already one of the most stigmatised. There are, and I say this as a feminist, a passionate, lifelong feminist. I've spent much of my life campaigning for women's rights. We don't have to look very far to see the real threats to women's rights right now. They come from men who attack sexually and violently women, who try to abuse women in a misogynistic way. They come from lawmakers in parts of the world trying to take away our reproductive rights and access to abortion. They come from oppressive regimes in places like Iran, which we're seeing women rise up admirably against right now. These are the threats to women's rights, and feminists should focus on them, not on trans women, who are not the threat to women's rights. Any man who seeks to abuse the law on gender recognition for nefarious purposes would be committing a criminal offence under the proposed bill that's before the Scottish Parliament. It's right to make a degrading and traumatic process simpler for trans people, and to make sure there are protections for anybody who would seek to exploit that legislation.
First Minister, we know that you have a very busy weekend ahead. We will let you get back to conference.